Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at how to install the Hub World MMO example project. The Hub World MMO in OWS 2 should work with Windows, Linux, or Mac OS, but this guide is only for Windows. If you're looking to use Linux or Mac OS, join the Discord and ask questions in the OWS Linux or OWS Mac OS channel. Everything you need to set up the Hub World MMO example project can be found at www.hubworldmmo.com. On the hubworldmmo.com site, we're going to follow the setup instructions. The first thing we have to do is install OWS 2 by following the setup instructions up to the point of getting your API key. Once you have your API key, you can continue with setting up the Hub World MMO example project. The first thing we want to do is install Visual Studio Community 2022. If you already have Visual Studio 2022 Professional or Enterprise, then you don't need to install Visual Studio 2022 Community. Visual Studio Community is free. Professional and Enterprise aren't. Visual Studio Code does not have enough to be able to run OWS 2 and the Hub World MMO example project. If you're using a Mac, there's Visual Studio for Mac. When we install Visual Studio 2022 Community, it's important that we check the ASP.NET and web development workload, the Node.js development workload, and the game development with C++ workload. Without those three, you won't be able to build either the OWS 2 project or the Hub World MMO UE5 example project. If you forget to install these workloads the first time, or you already have Visual Studio 2022 Community installed and you need to make changes, you can open up the Visual Studio installer, open up the Workloads tab, and make these changes and make sure all three of these are checked. After we install Visual Studio 2022 Community, we're getting ready to install Docker Desktop, and we need to make sure that virtualization is enabled. What you need to do is restart your PC and open your BIOS and make sure that virtualization technology is enabled. Each BIOS will look different, and some may call it something other than virtualization technology. If you're not sure, you can continue to install Docker Desktop, and it will tell you if you have not enabled virtualization technology yet. This next step is very important. If you install Docker Desktop without doing this step, it will install fine, but it will not work, and you cannot fix it after you've installed it the wrong way, meaning that you'll have to completely uninstall everything and start over. So you got to make sure you do this. You may already have this enabled, especially if you're running Windows 10. It seems at this point that only Windows 11 doesn't have this enabled, but it's hard to say. You might not have it enabled on Windows 10 either, so we're going to check. What you're going to do is you're going to open up your Windows search, and you're going to search for Turn Windows Features On or Off to open up the dialog that we see on the right side here. You're going to scroll down, check for Windows Subsystem for Linux. Make sure that it is checked before you proceed. This will modify how Docker Desktop is installed, and it will only work correctly with OWS 2 if Windows Subsystem for Linux is checked, and restart the computer before you continue to install Docker Desktop. The next thing we're going to do is install Docker Desktop from the link provided. As I mentioned earlier, make sure that you install Visual Studio 2022 and Windows Subsystem for Linux before installing Docker Desktop. After Docker Desktop is installed, we will continue the installation of OWS 2. I recommend forking your own copy of OWS 2 so that if you make any changes, such as a custom API, it makes it more easy to integrate new changes to OWS 2 into your version of OWS 2. Once you've forked the OWS 2 project, it's time to clone it in Visual Studio. Once you open Visual Studio, you can clone a repository, paste in your GitHub link, and then choose a path. Once OWS 2 has finished cloning, click on the Docker Desktop play button at the top of Visual Studio. Give it a minute or two to build the first time. Once you see the list of Docker Desktop containers in the bottom left corner, you'll know that you're all set to continue. Keep in mind that Docker Compose must be running in Visual Studio 2022 with the OWS 2 project the entire time you develop with OWS 2 or the Hub World MMO example project. If Docker Compose isn't running, OWS 2 isn't running. Next, we'll set up the database. OWS 2 currently supports Microsoft SQL, MySQL, and PostgreSQL. Only Microsoft SQL is officially supported. MySQL and PostgreSQL are only community supported. What this means is that at some point in the future, support for MySQL or PostgreSQL could be dropped. It also means that you may have to wait longer for updates when changes are made if you're running MySQL or PostgreSQL. For the purpose of this tutorial, we will be using Microsoft SQL. The first thing we need to do is open up Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. We'll connect with the default login and the default password. We're using SQL Server authentication, not Windows authentication. On certain PCs, you may need to connect to server name localhost. On other PCs, host.docker internal works best. If you do not see the Open World Server database, then there was an issue running the initialization script that restored the database. Please join the Discord channel if you have this issue, and someone should be able to help you with how to restore that database manually. We're going to click on the database and click on New Query. Our database is a little bit behind, and so we're going to need to run the update scripts to make sure that we bring it up to the current version. In the Databases MS SQL Update Scripts folder, you will find 3 update scripts. You can see that they're ordered by date from oldest to newest. Let's run them in order. If we double-click them, they will open in SQL Server Management Studio. We can run the scripts from oldest to newest by clicking on the Execute button. After running the update scripts, it's time to create our API key. We're going to copy this SQL script. We're going to edit the values. And click Execute. After we add the customer row, we can run this to get the API key. We'll save that API key for later. After we've set up OWS 2 and we have our API key, we can continue with step 2. The first thing we want to do here is fork the Hub World MMO project to your own GitHub. This is a very important step if you intend to make modifications, but I recommend doing this even if you don't plan to make modifications and are just looking at the project. From your GitHub account, go to the SaberDart Studios /Hub World MMO and click the fork button. Once you have your own fork, it's time to open up Visual Studio and clone the project. paste your repository URL, and find a path to save it to. Then click Clone. After it downloads all of the files, open config defaultgame.ini and put your API key in the OWS API customer key and save the file. Now open the OWS Instance Launcher appsettings.json and put your API key in OWS API key. You also need to set path to dedicated server to point to your Unreal Engine 5 editor and set path to uProject to point to the OWS Hub World MMO uProject file. When editing the path to dedicated server or the path to uProject, be careful to keep the double backslashes. Backslash is an escape character, and so if you want to actually have a backslash in your string, it must be in pairs of 2. If you were to change one of these to where there was only one, it will break and it will not run. We can find our path to uProject by locating our Hub World MMO uProject file. And then we make sure that it has double backslashes wherever they're needed. After we've updated the defaultgame.ini and the app settings JSON, it's back to the SQL Server Management Studio. We need to run an initialization SQL script. You can find the initialization SQL script under the SQL folder. The one that isn't labeled with a database name is for Microsoft SQL. We'll double-click to open it. At the top, we need to put in our customer GUID. This is the same as the API key. Make sure that when you enter it, that there's a single quote on either side. After entering our customer GUID or API key, it's time to press execute. This will add all of the default data for the Hub World MMO example project. Now we need to download the project content zip file. The project content zip file contains large binary files that are needed to run the Hub World MMO example project, but are not included as part of the GitHub repository. This file is rather large, multiple gigabytes, and so it may take a little while to download. After we finish downloading the project content zip file, it's time to unzip the 3 folders. I'm holding down Shift to select them, and then I'm pressing Control-C to copy them. And we're going to put them in the content folder inside our Hub World MMO example project. It'll take a little while to copy. Once our _HW assets, megascans, and MS preset folders have finished copying, It's time to generate our project file. Right-click on the OWS Hub World MMO U project and click on Generate Visual Studio Project Files. Open the OWS 2 project in Visual Studio 2022 and press Docker Compose. We've already done this step, so we are going to continue to the final step. We're going to open the new OWS Hub World MMO SLN file in a second copy of Visual Studio. We can do that by right-clicking on it and saying Open with Visual Studio 2022. Once Visual Studio 2022 finishes opening, click on the local Windows debugger. It will start building the Hub World MMO example project. It may take a little while the first time, but future executions will run much quicker. While you can open the Hub World MMO example project from the U project file after it's built the first time, I recommend using Visual Studio to run the Hub World MMO example project. It provides valuable debugging, and this is the way I always develop with Unreal Engine 5. Once the Unreal Engine editor opens, we can test to make sure it's working. We'll go to the Maps folder, and we will open up the Hub World map. There are two ways to work with the Hub World MMO example project in Editor. The first way is to test directly on the map with the editor running a server. And we can do that by going to the triple vertical dot and changing the net mode to play as client and pressing play. The other method is to open the login map and change the net mode to play as standalone. Using this method, we must be running the OWS instance launcher to continue. For the first method, the OWS instance launcher does not need to be running. To run the OWS instance launcher, we'll navigate to the OWS instance launcher directory, copy the path, and open PowerShell. Then type cd space and paste the path. After we're in the OWS instance launcher folder, we can type .NET OWS instance launcher.dll. It looks like it ran successfully. If you see an error message at this point, that will tell you that you have a configuration issue in your app settings JSON. Make sure that you go back and check your OWS API key, your path to dedicated server, and your path to U project. The error message may warn you which of those three fields is set up incorrectly. After our OWS instance launcher is running, we can continue by creating an account. At this point, these values for combat score and levels cleared are bogus, but we're going to continue and connect to the server. The server is starting up, and you can see that it received here starting up Hub World map on port 7778. We should connect shortly. So this here is the server window, and it's got the log visible here. So if there were any issues, we can see what was going on here. You can see our user session, the player that was joining, and their incoming start location. Some valuable information that can be used here to debug if you might be having trouble with what zone it's going to, what character is connecting, and what information. And so now we're connected to the game. So now instead of the Unreal Engine editor running the server, we actually have that separate server running on its own. If you have any questions related to this video, please leave your questions in the comments section. The Open World Server and Hub World MMO Discord link is in the video description if you want to discuss something in this video further, or you need help setting up the Hub World MMO example project. Please like and subscribe to be notified of future videos and to help with the algorithm. Until next time, have a good one.